Okay, that's 2 o'clock. Suppose we can get started since the recording will be there for anyone who joins late and wants to watch a bit later, if that's all right. So welcome to our session, just moving to the right slide. So welcome to our session looking at the experience of early career minority ethnic educators. So we titled this session, You Can't Be What You Can't See, because the theme of the Scottish Learning Festival is about being me, being us, focusing on learners. So here we're also thinking about Black, Asian and minority ethnic learners not being able to see themselves in the teaching profession due to the underrepresentation there, but also thinking about the adult learners' experiences of initial teacher education and ongoing professional learning. So my name is Melina Varduriev. I work for Education Scotland, and I run the Building Racial Literacy Programme, which is an anti-racist professional learning programme. I'm here covering for Nuzhat Uthmani, who is initially going to be co-chairing this session. Unfortunately, she's unable to make it, but this session is presented by the Scottish Government Working Group looking at diversity in the teaching profession and education workforce. And we've got guests who will be joining us as well to present. And I'll pass on very briefly to my co-chair to introduce himself.
Hello everybody, my name is Asif Tishti. I work for General Teaching Council for Scotland, and I am a Senior Education Officer there and the National Race Diversity Lead.
Thanks, Asif. So just a little reminder of our session protocols. So these are for the Scottish Learning Festival sessions. Remember that this session is being recorded, so please make sure that you turn off your mic when you're joining and turn off your camera as well, unless you want to speak later. We might have time for questions at the end of the session. Please be as present in the learning space as you can, and we encourage active participation, so be it in the chat pane or later on with hands up and questions if we have time at the end. If you wish, there is the closed caption feature on Microsoft Teams, so feel free to use that in terms of accessibility. And if you experience any technical issues, please let us know in the chat pane, so our speakeasy technicians can help you. If you lose connection, don't panic, just leave and then come back using the same joining links, and we'd love to hear more about your experience of the session. If you would like to tweet your experience using the hashtag SLF 2022. And just a final little reminder as well that this is a professional learning environment, so we welcome a diverse range of thought and opinion, but it's also important to note that the views and opinions expressed are the presenter's own. So with the underrepresentation of minority ethnic educators in Scotland, we can ask ourselves, how can we recruit and retain a diverse education workforce for every learner to thrive? So in this session, we're going to be looking at both the learner journey, so the adult learner journey, as well as the career journey of Black, Asian and minority ethnic educators in Scotland. We'll be addressing some issues that are listed there. So the value of a diverse workforce, thinking about the experiences of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic student teachers and early career teachers. We'll have a look at some positive action measures for retaining and increasing the number of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic teachers at all levels. And we'll also share some support available and share a call to action for all of us to think about. A bit of background around the work of this Scottish Government group that I mentioned. So from the wider Race Equality and Anti-Racism in Education programme, we have a subgroup looking at diversity in the teaching profession and education workforce. And before this subgroup came about, there was actually quite a lot of work in the Scottish Government from the Teaching a Diverse Scotland Working Group, chaired by Professor Rowena Arshad. I was also involved in this work, and we published a report in 2021 around teaching in a diverse Scotland. So lots of important key messages to consider. So diversifying the teaching profession is relevant to all areas of Scotland, not just the Central Belt, for example, where there might be more ethnic diversity. The issue of race equality needs to be addressed explicitly. We need to be recognising and counteracting racial microaggressions. Data is key, so we'll be talking a bit about data later. We need to be preparing teachers who are not race evasive and who are racially literate. So that's a lot of the professional learning that I'm involved in, for example, with the Building Racial Literacy programme. School leaders need to lead race equality, centering the voices of Black, Asian and minority ethnic teachers, young people, parents and carers throughout the process is really important. And we need to move beyond mentoring to sponsorship. So that's where we think about positive action measures that we'll be looking at later on. I'm now going to pass on to my co-chair Asif to talk about the value of a diverse workforce.
Hi everyone. So I know that Simon Sinek's work on trying to find our why is getting a lot of traction in Scottish education at the moment. So maybe we should dwell on that. What is the why of having a more racially diverse teaching workforce in Scotland? Melina mentioned there the Teaching a Diverse Scotland report published in 2018, authored by Rowena Arshad. And there, Professor Arshad outlines a whole range of structural and cultural barriers which exist, which mean that we don't have a racially diverse teaching workforce as compared to we do as a wider population. And in that report, she explains these in detail and goes to explain why we shouldn't just accept these as unchangeable, but instead should go about tackling them and breaking down those barriers. A really important part of the why in representation is simply because representation matters. We know that education is a really important part of our society, and we know that the teaching profession is a profession which is a prestigious one. So from that reason alone, we have a responsibility to look in our own back garden and check that there are not any barriers there, barriers that stop people from different backgrounds accessing the profession. But that's only one school of thought. It's really important also that we look at a more racially diverse teaching workforce in terms of having an improved educational experience. And there is a body of work which talks about this. If I think, for example, about work published in 2005 by Edinburgh University, which interviewed Scottish pupils in schools at the time. And 3 groups in that report talked about a more racially diverse workforce being desirable. Pupils themselves said they wanted more BME teachers in schools to increase their sense of belonging, their sense of inclusion in the education system. BME parents said that they wanted to have more role models for their children. And staff said that they thought that a more racially diverse teaching profession would help bring issues of equality and diversity alive in the classroom. And yes, of course, we have to acknowledge that there's a place there for the curriculum too. And we have to acknowledge also that it's not only BME teachers who are going to do that. There's a responsibility for all of us as allies to bring those issues alive in our classrooms. I talked about that sense of belonging, and that's equally important for pupils, but also for teachers. We know that the percentage of BME teachers that we have in Scotland is currently lower than our target. And that sense of belonging for teachers is incredibly important. That sense of being able to fall back on a supportive community of fellow educators. So a more inclusive and a more diverse profession will be more inclusive for BME teachers. Another really important benefit to talk about is a diversity or a racial diversity in the workforce brings with it a diversity and variety of thought and of perspectives. At the moment in Scotland, we are tackling big education challenges, such as closing the poverty-related attainment gap. So a variety of perspectives has to be an asset when it comes to tackling those problems. I'm going to also look at what the data tells us just now. So one thing to mention, first and foremost, is that we have a national target in Scotland. Our target is that by 2030, we want to reach a point where 4% of the teachers in Scottish schools come from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. Now, the 4% figure comes because that is currently the BME population of the Scottish population. That's based on the 2011 census, which is the latest available data that we have. And to give you an idea of the kind of progress and context for that, at the time of the 2018 TIDS report, the percentage of BME teachers in Scotland was 1.4%. And the latest data released in May tells us that now that percentage has risen to 1.8%. So there has been some positive progress in the drive for greater diversity in the teaching profession, with some new data showing small increase in the number of minority ethnic teachers. There's also a higher proportion of new teachers coming into the profession from minority ethnic backgrounds as compared to the overall teacher population. And we know that there are certain pockets of Scotland, such as Aberdeen and East Renfrewshire, where there's a slight increase, particularly in the secondary sector. But we know also that there's a great deal of work still to be done to reach the target. We also have to recognise that the data comes from, certainly the data for existing employed teachers comes from the teacher census. And that relies on ethnicity disclosure. And we know that not all BME teachers choose to disclose their ethnicity to their employer. And again, to look at the data to give you an idea of where we are in relation to the very ambitious target of 4% by 2030. If we wanted to look at that in terms of an intake into the profession of new teachers, we'd be looking at an 8 to 10% intake for BME teachers there. A big advantage now is that because we have the annual data report, we've got data that looks at all parts of the teacher journey, from applications into ITE, following all the way through to looking at, for example, the number of promoted teachers in Scotland. And I'll come back to looking at a key bit of data about early career teachers a bit later on when I talk about probation. But when we look at, for example, promoted teachers, well, there the picture is perhaps even poorer than in the wider teaching cohort. Less than 1% of promoted teachers are from a BME background. And in order to tackle that, we need to start partially by looking at the early phase. If we get the early phase, the early career stage right, then it will filter through and bear dividends in the future. And the final thing I would say about our target, our ambitious target for 2030, is that the target can be met, but we have to have proactive measures taken. A laissez-faire attitude, hoping that things will improve, will not be enough. We've got to take proactive measures. And that's why today we've selected some examples of proactive measures that have been taken across Scotland, which we hope will provide some sort of inspiration for all of us. Alina.
Thank you, Asif. Just going to share my screen very briefly again. Just to point out as well, I forgot to mention earlier, we have a list of resources mentioned in this session today on Padlet, so feel free to use a QR code if you're watching the recording to have a look at some examples of support and the resources that we mentioned. I'm now going to pass on to Khadija Mohammed, who is a senior lecturer at the University of West of Scotland. She was also involved in the Teaching and Diverse Scotland Working Group, and she is the chair of SAMI, and she is also the Race Equality and Anti-Racism in Education Programme Board Chair and a GTCS Vice Convener. So Khadija is going to be talking about how we support Black, Asian and minority ethnic student teachers as well as early career teachers. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass on to you, Khadija.
Thank you, Melina. Apologies, I've had a bit of a personal emergency this morning, so I'm sitting in my car now, just so that I can join in with the meeting. So just ignore the background. But yes, I'm really grateful to be here because I think it's such an important aspect that we need to look at in terms of how are we supporting the recruitment of our Black and minority ethnic students coming into the teaching profession. And what we find is that oftentimes they manage to secure an interview with a particular ITE programme, and they come back with on often an unsuccessful result, that they haven't managed to secure a place in the ITE programme. Where we do see the few and far between, again, the lack of support that they feel as they embark on their teacher education journey becomes quite problematic and complex at times. And what we've been doing from a SAME perspective is really supporting that application process, where we've often been speaking to young students at schools who are thinking about career choices, and then they laterally come over to us to think about a career in teaching, and we go through the application process quite, I suppose quite rigorously with them, and really get them to think about the added value that they would bring in terms of their cultural skills, their linguistic skills, the lived experience of being a BAME young person in Scotland, because all of that actually we refer to as their cultural wealth that they can bring to an interview experience, and talk about how they can relate that to the diversity within the schools and classrooms that we see today. So we talk about teasing out those skills, and the only thing that I get concerned about is how much we actually value, how much we place value on that as part of our recruitment panel, or actually also once they are in the programme with us. So we often try to look at support for BAME students within ITE programmes, but what we're finding again is that research is showing that many of our BAME students find some real problems when they get to placement. When I say problems, oftentimes they're citing the differential treatment that they experience whilst on placement. They see other peers getting more support than they are. And sometimes actually there's blatant racial microaggressions that they experience, whether it's from their own class teacher or whether it's from fellow colleagues within the staff room or young people themselves. And we need to learn and understand that, and begin to be able to support mentors within schools. So our classroom teachers, our probationer supporters within schools, to be able to actually acknowledge that that might happen, and actually begin to think about how we may address that. Part of that I hope to cover in the national framework that I'm developing for initial teacher education, and that really will look at the journey from recruitment right through to when they qualify as teachers and entering into that probationer and into their early career teacher phase. But a word about the ITE phase. So once they're on the programme, it's so important that our placement handbooks, our programme handbooks, have some sort of information there, specific information there about where they can go to or how they can begin to report and document any issues that they may be experiencing, because that's really important. What we found in the European Human Rights Commission on looking at racial harassment across university and college campuses was that almost 56% of students were not reporting the racial harassment that they were experiencing. So we need to clearly signpost our students on what process is there and how they're going to be supported. So there's that element to it. There's also our curriculum. So within even ITE, the curriculum that we are supporting our students with, do they see themselves being reflected within that curriculum? So it doesn't just necessarily apply to our young people within schools, but it also is important about the curriculum that we are delivering within initial teacher education. Are there opportunities for our BAME students, and all students actually for that matter, to really begin to discuss their own racial identity development? How are they progressing with that? How did I become to be who I am today? And actually it really helps to think about their professional identity, because when we look at the literature around professional identity construction, the personal and the professional are intimately linked. But what we find is our BAME students tend to leave the personal aspect of their identity at the university front door and come in and begin to assimilate into this process. And Chris Gaines would argue they're playing white. And so therefore we're losing that essence of the diversity in the first instance. So there's elements around our curricular, how are we using the resources that we have there, how are we preparing our students for placement and for the possibility that they may experience inequality, because we need to protect that also. So there's going to be guidance around placement support for mentors. How are we working closely with our in-school mentors to raise awareness of this and help them to develop processes that are fit for purpose in dealing with that. So there's a number of issues there, but I'll move on to the early career teacher phase, because it is a journey, isn't it? And even once they go into their probationary year, actually we find that that's where a lot of, and I think Asif might touch on statistics later, we find there's a drop off, right? We find that they've entered into a career, they may be the only BAME educator in a school, and the isolation starts to perhaps kick in at times. And how are we supporting that aspect there? And so from that end, it's really important that we keep connected. And again, SAMI plays a central role within that. We've developed a leadership and mentoring program for BAME educators, but I must stress it absolutely comes from an asset-based approach rather than a deficit approach. And it really is about, it's built around the 4A's model, around acknowledging, so that validation of their experiences and what they bring to teaching, because oftentimes they don't get that validation from around the school context. We then move on to looking at affirmation, about really looking at that added value they bring, that cultural wealth, and really affirming that to begin to think about how that can inform their teaching and learning and their own strengthening their own professional identity at the same point. That leads to really effective agency, where they really are acting as agents of change and are not shying away from bringing their cultural and linguistic and lived experiences to actually transform the curriculum into what we would argue is a culturally responsive anti-racist curriculum. But we also need to be mindful that that burden is not solely placed on their shoulders as well, that colleagues are working closely with them and supporting and nurturing those skills that they bring, and working together in a team to make sure that the curriculum is culturally responsive. And then actually there's that inherent activism that sits within that 4A's model for our teachers to continue to be activists in that role. And with, you know, the programme within Education Scotland and the REREP programme of building racial literacy, it just fits so beautifully within that, where colleagues are developing the language of race and racism and how it manifests, and actually really beginning to support not only the young people, the families, but their fellow BAME educators within that process too. But I wonder, Melina, if that's enough for my session, and I'll pass back over to yourself.
Thank you. That was perfect, Khadija. And thank you for your commitment, joining from your car. That's really, really helpful, everything you said. I'm now going to pass on again to my colleague Asif to talk a bit more about the probation experience and the support for probationers in particular.
Yeah, so we know that the probation year is a really, really critical year for teachers, and many probationers regard their probation year as the time when they stop becoming a teacher and start being a teacher. And the GTCS engages early on with teachers at this phase. So if a prospective teacher is doing their ITE in Scotland, they'll get a presentation from the GTCS in autumn talking about how they register, and in the spring they'll get a presentation about the year ahead. And there's also support in terms of the information and support on the GTCS website, where there's a probation section. And my colleagues have been working really hard over the summer to review and refresh the information that's on there. Of course, it marks a really important shift in responsibility for support for teachers at this stage of their career, from the initial teacher education institutions over to employers. And we do know that some local authorities have been telling us that they have specific action plans in place for supporting BME teachers, and indeed for increasing the racial diversity of the workforce. And we know of other local authorities where they're setting up local networks of support for BME teaching staff. But one of the main pillars of support for probation teachers is their supporter. And every year we hear lots of fantastic examples of working relationships that have been built up between the supporter and the probationer, where the support is designed and individualized for the probationer themselves. And increasingly, moving on from what Khadija was saying, there's a centered focus on this idea of the teacher or professional identity. And I can see over the next while that will be an increasingly important notion that we have in that relationship between the probationer and the supporter. And the GTCS works really closely with probation managers from across Scotland. And I know in my own discussions with them that they're really engaged on the topic of enhancing the probation experience for BME teachers and working towards a 4% target. I mentioned earlier, and Khadija touched on it as well, about the issue of drop-off. This is a really important bit of data for us. So we know that there are fewer BME teachers in employment the year after probation as compared to the wider cohort. So in 2020 to 2021, 16% of primary teachers, of BME primary teachers, found permanent employment, and that compares to 23% of the wider cohort. Now, the data doesn't tell us why this is. So we don't know, for example, if more BME teachers are deciding at the end of their probation that this isn't a profession for them, or whether more of them are unsuccessful in finding a post. But both of these outcomes are undesirables, and they're ones that we need to mitigate against. It's a trend that we need to just be careful with. And why? Well, mainly because the data tells us that the ITE intake is moving in the right direction, but that will be undermined further down the line if there's a drop off in the employment phase. So recently I've convened a working group looking specifically at early stage career for BME teachers, with participation from BME early career teachers themselves, from SAMI, for example, and from probation managers from across Scotland, and me from the GTCS. And we are going to be looking at potential challenges for BME teachers in their early career stage and how these might be mitigated, and look at examples of emerging practice across Scotland. Not all teachers go through the induction scheme, so one key question we'll be looking at is how do we support flexible route probationers as well. But a really key area for us will be looking at that 4% national target, because it's really incumbent on all of us to look at the target and think about how we're going to move towards meeting it. So we'll be looking as practitioners involved in the architecture of the early career experience about what we can do in our part to meet the target. And I should stress it's not just employers who are providing support here. You've heard about the support that SAMI provide, but also the EIS and the NES-UWT also have networks for BME teachers. And these are really crucial in terms of well-being, which has a key role in retaining teachers. And the final thing I'd say is that it's important that we don't look at teacher development as a continuum, so that we're not separating out ITE from probation and then the early career stage, but instead we see them as a continuum. And I think from that perspective that Stepping Stones has got a real important role to play here. So it's a programme designed specifically for post-probation teachers in the first 4 years of their career, and you don't have to be in employment to sign up for Stepping Stones. So it's being developed with General Teaching Council and Education Scotland in partnership with Columba 1400 and with local authorities. And if I just look at the kind of the vision statement for Stepping Stones, it says, "I know who I am and where I belong. I own my own unique story of both growth and well-being." And that, of course, could apply to any teacher, but I think it possibly speaks even more to BME teachers themselves. Thanks, Melina.
Thanks, Asif. And just to echo what both you and Khadija was saying, that support network is so important for earlier career teachers and probationers. Unfortunately, we are unable to share the experience of a probationer. We had someone lined up, but she has had, she's unable to make it. So just to very briefly share my own probation experience, this was 6 or 7 years ago when I was an English teacher. The most valuable support I found was from the Scottish Association for Minority Ethnic Educators, so SAMI, and the Leadership and Mentoring Programme. Again, this is linked in the Padlet if you're interested, but also the trade union support that I experienced. So for Black and Asian and minority ethnic educators, that was where I was able to overcome that sense of isolation I felt as an educator that wasn't too sure what to do with her Indian and French identity, not quite fitting in, and then realizing that there is actually diversity out there and we can keep supporting each other. So without further ado, we're actually going to move on to the next stage of the career journey for Black, Asian, and minority ethnic educators. So thinking about moving up towards promotion so for example, promoted posts. So we're going to be sharing some examples of positive action measures that have taken place. And I'll very briefly mention as an example, Glasgow City Council for the past 2 years now has been running a positive action measure to increase the number of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic educators in promoted posts, so principal teacher posts for 5 educators. That is a fixed term to gain that experience to then move on to promoted posts. So in Glasgow City Council, I saw from the Scottish, one of the sessions this morning, I think it was something like 27% of the pupils, the learners in Glasgow, are from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds, but that's not represented in the teaching workforce as well as in promoted posts. So that's an example of some legal measures we can take to try and increase that number and overcome some of the institutional barriers we face with the glass ceiling or concrete ceiling at times it might feel like. So we are also going to share some examples, just sharing once more, from the University of Edinburgh. So I'm joined by my 2 colleagues, Kevin Brack and Rosemary Grady, who are lecturers in educational leadership at Murray House of Education, the University of Edinburgh. So I'm going to pass on to Kevin first, I believe, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Melina. I think it's myself that's going to go first. Hi, everybody. My name's Rosemary Grady. As Melina said, I'm a lecturer in educational leadership and learning at Murray House. We are going to share a little bit of some strategic work that we've been doing. Obviously, we don't have a lot of time to share that this afternoon, but if anybody would like to get in contact with us to speak a bit longer about what we've been doing, I'm more than happy for you to do that. So just a little bit of background. Murray House benefits from a very strong partnership working group with our local authorities that we work collaboratively with. So that's City of Edinburgh, Fife, Scottish Borders, Mid Lothian, East Lothian and West Lothian. And as part of our strategic work, in fact, our key strategic work for the whole of last session, we had a formal commitment to enacting the recommendations of the Teaching in a Diverse Scotland report written by Professor Rowena Arshad, as we've heard. And we wanted to look at the different circles of influence that we had across our collaborative groups, so acknowledging the fact that our local authorities deliver a lot of professional learning to folks that are coming through and becoming teachers and then who are going for promotion as well and developing their own leadership, and then our own offer within our Masters of Education, Leadership and Learning. So we wanted to look collectively at what we were doing to support our colleagues who are BME and also to acknowledge what's already been shared, the underrepresentation of BME educators and then also their opportunities to progress and to become promoted members of staff. So we looked at a number of different aspects related to the recommendations, and we're very aware that as a group, myself and my colleague Kevin, who's going to speak a bit in a moment or two, and two of our representative colleagues from the local authorities, that we were not folks with lived experience of this. So what we also did once we started to shape together what we wanted to do or what we were suggesting we would do, we reached out to Melina and Khadija, who are both on the call, and to Professor Arshad herself to act as critical friends for us, to help us to shape our thinking. And I think that was an important and helpful step for us. So we thought that identification of BME colleagues within our partnership would be a first step in this work. And we know that that provides us with some challenges for our local authority colleagues, because as Asif said, that's looking at data that might not be fully accurate. It's depending on many assumptions and other folks disclosing ethnicity, which is not always the case. We discussed as a group when we were planning our positive action the nuanced complexities of this work, and we reaffirmed our commitment to work with and through our colleagues within our partnership by listening to them and being guided by them, and again not taking that deficit view as it's already been mentioned, but actually working with them and not doing sort of well-intentioned stuff to them, but actually working with them and listening and being guided by them. I think our group reaffirmed our belief that there are inherent and unique challenges for our BME colleagues in being successful in gaining leadership posts due to issues of inherent structural and systemic biases that have already been mentioned today. And we wanted to see, well, what can we do that's actually tangible and positive to help with that and to work against that. We also acknowledged the work that was already going on in our local authorities, so a lot of work in the City of Edinburgh. We also looked to the work that's going on with the BRL programme and more broadly in Education Scotland and GTCS. And we looked to see, well, what's happening there, how can we tap into that? And we're also aware of the work of SAMI, of course, and other work that's going on in the University of Edinburgh more broadly. As we've heard already, there are issues, of course, about recruitment to teaching. So ITE and teacher education is an important link that we have, but we were looking specifically more about, well, what happens when folks do become into the system, and part of that pipeline, for a want of a better word, what are the opportunities to progress, to have opportunities for leadership? And overall, one of our main core aims is to think, well, how can we make sure or work towards in the next couple of years that we've got more folks coming on to our Into Headship programme at the University of Edinburgh that are identifying as BME colleagues, and what are the things that we need to put in place all along their journey towards leadership to support and to mentor, to guide and to sponsor those colleagues in appropriate ways. So, as I say, part of that is that recognition that it's not just what happens when folks get to us in the university, but also the professional learning opportunities that they have within their own context and their own local authorities, and that was a crucial recognition. So, as I say, our overall aim of this work, the strategic work, was thinking about the appropriate support and opportunities that we can give to aspirant BAME leaders. And one marker of that we would like to see is that folks are coming through onto Into Headship. It's not the only marker, but we thought that would be quite a significant one. So the work that we developed and started to enact last year, which is continuing in the main and developing further, was organised into 3 strands of activity. So the first strand was about us thinking about establishing a network for within our local collaborative partnership for BME colleagues that were linked to our partnership, and that was thinking about identification, nurturing, sponsorship, mentoring, etc., and engaging with those colleagues to work with them to ascertain any needs or development opportunities that they might initiate and tell us about, and see what we could do to support that. The other part of that was something that ended up being quite challenging, actually, because we also wanted to offer some priority places on our MEd Leadership and Learning and a couple of our postgraduate certificates. So one would be core processes, which would be open to classroom teachers typically, and the second one was middle leadership and management, which, as you can imagine, is for aspirant middle leaders. We faced a number of challenges, and our local authority colleagues faced those challenges on our behalf, really, and much of that was about data gathering, knowing who's there, and making links and building relationships and finding out, you know, who's there, who would want our support, does the nature of that support look like. We also looked into the legalities of much of the language that we used in our communications. That was important. So we quickly learned the difference between positive discrimination and positive action. And it was very important to us that we made sure that we were, in our well-intentioned positive action, we weren't then limiting the opportunities for other folks with other protected characteristics as well. So we did recruit to both of those postgraduate certificates, and we were not able to recruit any BME colleagues to that. But there's a lot of lessons learned, we would say, about data access and sharing of data that we will be building on, and Kevin will speak a wee bit about that as we continue to progress and look at that again in our next phase of recruitment. The second stream of work is that we developed a number of professional learning events that were open to all of our colleagues within our partnership, and Kevin actually hosted a number of panel discussions to unpick in a safe space some of these complex issues that we've been talking about already today, and we're going to do more of them. And again, Kevin will explain what our plans are for moving these professional learning opportunities forward in the future. And our third stream of activity was really to think about us as a collaborative group and our own professional learning and shared understandings. And last year we were able to engage some external speakers to help us to unpick together the complex issues around this piece of work. And that has been really refreshing to have time and opportunity to do that, again in a safe space, to think about what the implications are for us within our roles. So, for example, ourselves as lecturers on a Masters of Education programme, but also our colleagues in local authorities who have a great deal of responsibility and opportunity in terms of the development and enactment and delivery of professional learning right across their local authorities. So we did a good piece of professional learning there, and it was helpful to, I suppose, give us the opportunities to develop some shared understandings about that. And Kevin will tell you a wee bit more about our next steps in that regard as well. So, Kevin, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Melina. I know we're coming close to our time. We'll just take 1 minute to share our next steps. Is that okay? Fantastic. So as Rosemary says, we are continuing this important work this year alongside our colleagues across the local authorities. So there's 3 broad pieces of work that we're going to be working on and together over the course of this academic session. So the first one is to really formalise that network. So we have an informal network that we've built over the course of the last year to support BME colleagues into the programme and on the programme and through the programme as well. And we're going to formalise that network with some of the connections that we've made over the course of the last number of months. We're also going to continue our professional learning events that Rosemary spoke about, and if you want to watch those events, they're on the Murray House YouTube channels. If you Google that, you can see the recordings of the events and the events that we've got planned for this year. Look at the leadership of anti-racist education, how you deal with conflict and issues of tensions from parents, for example, around some of those things as well, and looking at the experiences of BME children and families as well too. And the third stream of work that we're going to look at is using an inequalities impact assessment to look at our own programme in MA Leadership and Learning, but also alongside our colleagues in local authorities to get them to use that as a tool to audit their own provision and to think really carefully about the next steps in terms of what they offer and how we ensure these things are offered in the right way. And the last thing to mention is the Saroj Lal bursary, which Edinburgh University has just established a year ago, and it offers a bursary to a Black minority ethnic colleague on the PGD primary programme as well. So we're very well aware, Melina, that these are very initial steps. We haven't seen a lot of success so far, but we are absolutely clear in our commitment that we are going to continue this work and hopefully see success in the near future. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks, Rosemary, as well. And that's really inspirational to hear about that, and particularly the kind of plugging away at trying to achieve improvement in the system there. Professor Arshad in a report said that the lack of diversity in the teaching profession was a persistent and long-term issue that needs a persistent and long-term response, and that's really exemplified in the examples you've just given us there. So it's unfortunately time to wrap up now. I've really enjoyed listening to our speakers today, and I hope that you have too. Having listened to the contributions, we'd really like you to engage with the Padlet after our session ends. There's information there about support that's available, and there's also a section for questions for you to ask. Since there's not enough time for question and answers today, we wanted to give you a space for you to ask your own questions, which we as a panel can then look at and respond to. So don't hold on to any questions. I see one of the SLF sessions this time is called Dinny Had Your Wheesht. So Dinny Had Your Wheesht, and if you've got any questions, just please do add them in. I said earlier that a proactive approach is what we need to increase the representation of BME teachers in the Scottish teaching workforce. So really importantly, what we'd like you to do now is, now that we looked at our why earlier on, perhaps to answer the question of what now? Each of us has a role within our own sphere of influence to take action. So having listened to some contributions today, what will you do next, or what might you do next? We're all on this journey together, and if we can share our next steps together, then it will really be helpful in building confidence. So finally, I just want to say thank you to my fellow panel members who've given very generously of their time, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.